Hi there. I'm going to stand so I can pace awkwardly. My name is Matthew McGuire. I am from West Virginia originally, so not from these parts. I grew up in the Appalachian areas and knew what poverty looks like on a community scale. And I also had some pretty intense personal experiences with mental health, disaster, crisis stuff growing up with friends and within my community. So from the beginning, I was primed with an interest in kind of disaster recovery and crisis work. I don't know why, being a little boy from West Virginia, I also had a focus on the international field as well. So I really wanted to find a way to kind of merge and blend the two growing up. I was told by my undergrad college advisor that that was impossible. And one thing about people from West Virginia are we're very stubborn. So I decided that I damn well would find a way to be able to blend international and crisis and trauma work. So I found a program actually in Denver, at the University of Denver, called International Disaster Psychology. There are approximately 3 of those programs within the United States, 2 of which are PhD programs, so they're heavily research-oriented. The one I went for was a clinical program. I wanted to use the clinical work so that I could be more accessible to people kind of at the ground level in the trenches. And so I also wanted to find kind of a procedural master's degree that would let me go into the field, work with local nonprofits, with international organizations, with governmental organizations. And that's what that degree program was exactly. So I graduated in 2013 with a master's in international disaster psychology. I was trained both in clinical work. I have been working with the Center for Immigrants and Immigration Services since my first year in grad school, which provides pro bono mental health, law, and community resourcing for asylum seekers, so those who are undocumented individuals. And I'm the director of social services for that organization. So I do one-on-one therapy with people who have been through genocide, who have been through mass traumas, who have been through mass interpersonal violences, who have firsthand been tortured. And so I kind of work with them to be both a cultural ambassador and also to help with trauma, treatment, and recovery. That's my specialty in mental health. I'm also currently working with Jefferson Center for Mental Health, doing community outreach. There's a new Colorado State initiative currently called the CCC, Community Crisis Connections. That program is all about being able to engage the community via mental health, more where the community is, where the needs are proper. So again, that rang very true to what I wanted to do whenever I found out about this initiative. It launched December 1st of 2014, and throughout the state, several 24-hour, 7-day-a-week walk-in crisis centers were established. 24/7 crisis phone line was established. And also what I initially got hired on at Jefferson Center for Mental Health, there was a mobile crisis team, which is as exactly as it sounds. We as therapists can go into the community, meet people who are gravely disabled, highly psychotic, suicidal, kind of agoraphobic, not wanting to leave their homes with really intense mental health things, do full assessments and evaluations on them, and then figure out how we can best help them there in that moment. So that's kind of my main passion right now. And also, last year I worked with Aurora Mental Health on a contract through SAMHSA and the National Institute of Health to directly do community engagement following the Aurora theater shootings. So I was one of the community outreach counselors for that initiative, and our job was to go into the community, talk about what trauma, what resiliency, what crisis and disaster looks like for the individual, for the community, for the family, for the nation, and then ways that we can respond to these things that we feel pretty hopeless and helpless about whenever we experience them or hear about them as a public, and we know they're going to have ripple effects through our community over time. So that was really meaningful work, and yeah, that's how and I've also spent time abroad working both in Haiti and Nepal most recently, doing disaster mental health recovery. I taught psychology at a university in Haiti and put together a community mental health recovery clinic with individuals who had been affected by the 2010 earthquake. There's still a lot of pressing needs that have not been able to be addressed within the country due to such a low economic standard and level of living. So I was able to work with people, peer advocates, community leaders who really wanted to try and address some of those things. And that was incredible work. And I worked in Nepal with a nonprofit that worked with at-risk male street youth. And so I did a lot of social work type stuff there with the population that's deemed the unmentionables or the untouchable class. So the class of people who nobody in that community and those countries really want to help. Things are kind of changing in that part of the world, and so there's a crippling need and a very specific need on how we need to address some of those mental health, disaster, trauma, recovery things within the community. So it's been a pleasure to be able to kind of share my education and my training on a global standard or a global level, and I hope to keep working to kind of make more standardized approaches that we can do that are multi-sectoral, that we can engage on all levels from the international, the federal, the communal, and go from there. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Garst. I'm a behavioral health specialist for the Office of Emergency Preparedness and Disaster Response with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Got it all out. And I am actually pretty good to that position. My background is in child trauma, and I got into the disaster work, I think initially working with the public school system, helping them develop their disaster planning and response recovery plan that was acquired at schools after Columbine. Was also involved in a school-wide recovery effort after a student was stabbed to death in the high school cafeteria. But also have worked on the national level with groups around child mental health and disaster response. Most of, at least the last 14 years, I've worked for the Mental Health Center in Denver, and was their disaster response coordinator for several years. And was involved with the Aurora Theater shooting, the Boulder floods. We activated our team and supported the other mental health and mental health partners. There is a statewide disaster behavioral health network that's really comprised primarily of the community mental health centers. And but also we have another group called COCERN, which stands for Colorado Crisis Education and Response Network. That's made up of some of the other providers that do disaster behavioral health in Colorado. So Red Cross, Salvation Army, the Colorado Organization of Victims Advocates, school psychologists, so a number of organizations there. One is disaster behavioral health, particularly if you're coming from kind of a technical risk assessment standpoint. I'd like for everybody to hold up your hand. Take your thumb, cross it, let it cross, and then close it. So this is your brain. And here's what happens to your brain when it's under stress. So this area right here represents the limbic system. And the limbic system is kind of always assessing information that comes in. And if it determines that there's some danger out there, then it essentially hijacks the rest of the brain. And it begins shutting down the higher functions of the brain sequentially. So this area is the frontal cortex. That's the area up in here. And that is the part of the brain that kind of controls executive functions, problem solving, planning, goal setting, judgment. So that's kind of the first thing that shuts down. And then the right side of the brain shuts down, which is the creative part of the brain. It's part of the brain that deals with novel stimuli. And then the left side of the brain, which is language, and also part of the brain that kind of deals with routine activities. So what's left is this limbic system that's preparing the body to respond to that danger. It's that freeze, fight, flight, faint response. And typically, once the danger's gone, the brain recovers. But if there's extreme stress, then this limbic system continues to function, and the rest of the brain is shut down. So the role of disaster behavioral health, the initial response, is really to help people regain function of the rest of the brain. It's to get them to a point where they can begin to take care of themselves and those around them. So we tend to kind of give disaster behavioral health, it's a very narrow definition. But I think several things happen. One, anybody that's involved in a disaster, even those of us that go out and do disaster behavioral health, our brains shut down as well. We have the same reaction as anybody else. So the way that we try to overcome that is to train. When the brain shuts down, training takes over. Those of you that are working even in technical areas, that can happen. So the idea of how do you take care of yourself so that you're beginning to kind of get things going again. But even broader, I think looking at a definition of disaster behavioral health really encompasses everything that happens after an event, during and after an event, and even before that. Much of what we do in the state is to help local communities really plan, prepare, and train around responding to a disaster. So there's a lot of preparation that goes on. But if you think about what you might do, how does that help people in terms of taking care of what they need to do to recover? And I think anything that fits within that is really disaster behavioral health. So developing, one of the most important things in recovery is that social network and helping those networks re-engage because they're often very much disrupted after disaster. And lots of ways that can happen. Helping people begin to recover the property or start over. We talked a lot about resilience and what Lisa's going to talk about. But one of the best definitions of resiliency comes out of the recovery Colorado, which really talks about resiliency is the ability to rebound and adapt to or even thrive in the face of change or challenge. And I think the thrive piece is really, so, taking this event that totally disrupts people's lives, the lives of the community, and in time, creating something that maybe is stronger and even better than what there was before. And anything that really helps that happen, to me, is about wellness, it's about community, and all of those things are really about behavioral health and wellness.
Hi, I'm Lisa Ledoux, and thank you, Lynn. That was the best segue into what I wanted to talk about that I could have asked for. I am a licensed clinical social worker and a clinician by profession, but I wanted to just give you a brief overview of my background because it kind of lets you know why it's kind of hard for me to characterize myself as a clinician or a trainer or a responder, because I'm really kind of all of that. I've been lucky enough to have some incredible experiences in my professional career. So I really got into this work because I was working in hospitals in California, and I was the only hospital social worker to cover a 240-bed hospital. And it was not discharge planning, it was all clinical kinds of response. And I found that my favorite place to be was the emergency room. And I went, oh no, I'm one of them. I didn't like being in med-surg, I didn't want to be in the nursery, putting babies in protective custody, I didn't like working in peds because those kids cried too much, and but I loved being in the ER. So I kind of had an idea that's where I was headed back there. That was in the late 80s. So I knew then. And I started getting involved with disaster planning with the hospitals, and really, that's when critical incident stress debriefing was just getting really big, and I was angry that Mitchell and Everly took a program that I was pretty good at and got famous and rich with it, and I was still working in a hospital liking the ER. But I started training hospital teams and got very involved with the critical incident stress management program way in its infancy. And just as a side note, have graduated myself out of CISM practice and accepted in an altered, modified way of doing it because of the research and my own experiences of it not always working so well. Then I joined the American Red Cross in 1996 and quickly went to Puerto Rico following a major hurricane, went to Guam after a super typhoon, back to Puerto Rico. They started accusing me of only doing island jobs. So I went to North Carolina for Hurricane Floyd, and then really the huge turning point, I think, in my career, moving from disaster in general to trauma, was after spending a month at the Pentagon after 9/11. I truly had some signs of trauma myself, and it took me a little while to recognize those. But when I did, I realized that the cognitive therapy that I'd been using for years was not working for me. And so probably hadn't worked for some other people, too. So I dove in to learn as much as I could about trauma, from Bessel van der Kolk, one of the pioneers, and eventually got into working with the somatic work, to really work with the body, because that clearly to me was the missing link. Not to get rid of everything else, but to add a piece when I encountered significant trauma. And then I joined the National Disaster Medical System, a member of a DMAT, Disaster Medical Assistance Team, in about 2003, 2002, 2003, somewhere in there. With Iowa 1 DMAT, I went to Hurricane Katrina and worked and lived and slept in tents for a couple of weeks and got the opportunity to try some of these approaches with Hurricane Katrina survivors and first responders. Went with then Oklahoma 1 DMAT to Hurricane Gustav down in Monroe, Louisiana. And then sometime after that, I transferred to the Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team. They have one team in the country called the Victim Information Center Team, and we interview family members of the presumed deceased to gather information that then goes to the morgue to help identify the human remains that are left. That kind of makes me remember that in 2000, a colleague and I were granted federal money to start the National Mass Fatalities Institute. So I've been doing mass fatalities training since about 2002 as well, just as another kind of training that really brings in everything. In 2010 to about 2012, I was the Disaster Mental Health Coordinator here in Boulder County, so I got to work after the 4 Mile Canyon fires up in the mountain communities affected, and got to know the Boulder system. Moved back to Fort Collins, where I live in northern Larimer County, north of Fort Collins, and left that position and became an academic. So I worked as faculty at Colorado State University School of Social Work, as well as DU's International Disaster Psychology Program. I must have started right after you graduated, Matt. Yeah. So, so I have that academic side to me, and I enjoy that. But I'm really more of a boots on the ground kind of person. Evidenced in part by the fact that I'm a volunteer firefighter up in Glacier View, so I participated in the Hyde Park fire as a firefighter. One of the fire chiefs that I'd worked with here in Boulder County was on the incident management team during the fire, and came up and asked if I was going to help Larimer County with their mental health issues after the fire, like I did in Boulder County. And I said, "No, I'm a firefighter up here." He said, "No, I don't mean, but when it's over, are you going to?" I said, "No, I'm a firefighter. I can't do that." And actually, Kurt Drennan called me to ask me how I was doing, and I said, "I don't know how I'm doing, but right now I just have to deal with this as a member of the community and a firefighter." So I did not become involved with Larimer County's mental health issues after the Hyde Park fire, because I was impacted, and my identity with that was as a firefighter, and it's really different, which has helped me tremendously in working with first responders, because I really understand it in a way I never did before, and I thought I did as a disaster responder. It's very different. With somatic experiencing teams, I've been to Thailand after the Indian Ocean tsunami and provided interventions and training there. Then we went to India 6 months later, did the same kind of thing there. I was asked to lead a team to Sichuan, China after the earthquake there in 2008, and we were in a very devastated area of China. And then most recently, I just came back from Nepal in September, went over there with just another colleague, and we did training for doctors and social workers and counselors on understanding trauma and learning some of the basics of stabilization so the brain can connect and they can get going again. And one of my most proud affiliations is I'm also a Team Rubicon member. So last weekend I was up in Wyoming helping Team Rubicon clean out the debris from wildfires that had spread rapidly through the area with my mask, goggles, hard hat, and grime to do that job. So that's why I'm saying it's a little hard for me to classify whether I'm a trainer, a responder, an interventionist. I still consider myself very much a clinician, but kind of a boots on the ground kind of clinician. So I wanted to pick up with what you were talking about, Lynn, with the brain. And that's a large part of the training that I do, because I think it is the piece that's missing for people to understand trauma. That we have to get ourselves stabilized before we can use our whole brain and be able to keep going and get to that point of thriving. So one of the things that I think is missing in our systems is, one, a way to link, and it sounds like, Matt, you did a nice job of it when really it sounds like maybe the work you're doing now of linking that first wave of crisis counselors that goes out with disaster mental health immediately after disaster, and then linking them with ongoing services. There's a gap there. Our last, with the floods that happened here in Colorado, the model for disaster behavioral health was modified a little bit, and the FEMA crisis counseling grants were used more to develop these outreach teams, which I totally support. But they were they were very supportive and didn't necessarily link to ongoing services for those few who definitely need free or low-cost mental health services. And so I think we have to look at how to link that. And it looks like you're doing some of that, and a lot of it needs to be in the home. So after the floods, so that was after the fire. After the floods, I jumped back into the disaster mental health world again, and developed a program that kind of came to me about 2 o'clock in the morning when I couldn't sleep, called Disaster Recovery Navigators. And the program is really kind of based like a community-based mental health and substance abuse program for the chronically and persistently mentally ill and addicted population, where we realize, and in this case, thinking about disasters, that we realize some of the people don't regain their ability to use all the parts of their brain so that they can problem solve, so they can follow corrections, and so they can, any of you who've been involved in disaster recovery know, you have to meet deadlines, and you have to fill out documents, and you have to do things that overwhelm everybody who has recovered. And so if you haven't recovered, you haven't got your full brain functioning, your whole body and mind connected, there's no way you can do that stuff, and those people are falling through the cracks. And all of the wonderful work that the long-term recovery groups are doing, in my mind, they're still missing this little piece of how do we capture those people, how do we work hand in hand with them in their homes, fill out their documents with them, meet with them at the caseworker's office, because they can't get to those offices. They can't fill out those documents. They can't battle with their insurance companies who they trusted all those years to give them what they thought they were going to get. And now they found out that there's all these different restrictions. And so I think linking disaster behavioral health services and all we know about the brain with recovery case management services is a way to start bridging some of these gaps and linking the services so we don't have the people who can't meet the deadline, who are overwhelmed by the trauma, get in and get the help they need. So that's one of the programs that I really would like to see us start focusing on. And why? Just because, like Lynn said, it doesn't matter who we are, no matter what our role is. If we don't have the capacity to use all of our executive functions in our brain, our family suffers. If one family suffers in a neighborhood, the whole neighborhood suffers. If one neighborhood is weakened by a disaster, the whole community has lost some of its resilience. So I think looking at ways to start blending all the things that all three of us are talking about together add to building resilience and really enhancing that capacity for thriving, rather than like some of the old FEMA language of returning to pre-disaster normal. We're not interested in that anymore. We want better. We want thriving. And I think by addressing it, a lot of it has to be from this disaster behavioral health perspective, so that people can get stabilized and back into functioning the best they can.
You know, we talk a lot about trauma. When I started this work, trauma was something very specific in the medical field. You know, I talked about damage to the body from some external force. And today it's something I think is really overused. You know, typically what we think of as trauma is extreme stress that overwhelms the body's, the person's ability to cope. And it's typically associated with the threat of death or severe bodily injury, or seeing somebody injured or killed. Not everyone who experiences traumatic stress, in fact, the vast majority, do not experience traumatic symptoms. We certainly experience stress symptoms, and we talk about kind of normal reactions to stress. But in a disaster, the most common reactions are grief. They're grief and loss. Not only loss of property and lives, loss of safety, a sense of security, loss of community, a sense of future. And, you know, those kind of recovering or working through that grief is really something that happens at an individual and community level. And it's where those community supports are so critical. You know, I really believe that communities, the local community, is the best support for people in that community. And I think if we're talking about some innovative ways of disaster behavioral health, it's really about how do we strengthen those social networks that are so critical to working through that grief and loss. And one of the things that disaster behavioral health is doing is getting connected with the faith-based communities and really looking at spiritual care. When we talk about kind of getting people back to more normal functioning, which is the role of disaster behavioral health, but there's a larger piece around making meaning of this event. And that's where the faith-based communities can be very helpful for so many people. So we need to look at how we integrate that. You know, one of the sessions earlier today, talking about the social networks and volunteers, the important role that they play in overall recovery, and I think in people's mental health and mental wellness as well. Thinking about the role of technology, you know, what would it have meant to the Gulf Coast, and particularly New Orleans, if when Katrina hit land, the surge was 80% less and the winds were 50% less? We probably would not have seen the disaster what we saw. To me, that would have been a huge, or had a huge behavioral health impact. So I'm beginning to think about mental health, behavioral health. And when we talk about behavioral health, we're talking about not just mental health, but substance abuse as well, because we know that substance abuse is something that increases significantly after the we all have a role in our community's recovery. And to me, that's the huge piece. That's the most significant piece of the disaster behavior response.
So now I'm going to do what I really like to do, and throw another monkey wrench in all the things we've been talking about. All of the responses that have been addressed, and we are exceptionally lucky, I think, to be in the time and the place that we are to respond to the disasters that have come up in our community. We are more resourced than I think we've ever been, which is very sad to say, because our resources are still quite limited. And we're addressing these things in a more, what we call trauma-informed care model. So we're taking into, as Lynn was talking about, this model of the brain, neurological functioning, biological functioning, how it's affected by trauma. We're able to talk about that now in a forum like this. And so we as professionals outside of these forums are also being allowed to talk about those models, which is incredible. It's incredible because since time immemorial, mental health concerns have been seen as a failing of the person. They have been seen as a religious persecution. They have been seen as something that's extra that is making that person less functional as a human. And so mental health has been stigmatized since the dawn of time, pretty much. And so in the United States, there's kind of a changing wave. There's a shift on focusing on mental health, what it means, looking at the person, looking at it from more of a medical model, and destigmatizing a lot of the stuff behind mental health. But here's my little monkey wrench. What about outside of the United States? There are 7 billion people who experience this thing that Lynn was talking about. Every person globally has this, well, we believe, has this biological and neurological response to trauma. Those persons that experience those things outside of the United States, they do not have the resources. They do not have the destigmatized mental health approach. Mental health is not as easily, readily, or even been made aware of in several of those communities. And believe it or not, but Aurora, Colorado, I jokingly refer to it as the Ellis Island of our time. Aurora, Colorado has one of the most diverse populations in the United States, and multicultural and international populations daily are flooding to Aurora and to the state of Colorado because the state has opened its doors to international undocumented populations, which is really cool. There's several resources available within our state for those populations. So, both globally and locally, how do we create responses that benefit the United States citizens, those affected by these mass interpersonal violences, by these natural disasters? But then, how do we reach out to the populations that are now United States citizens and belong, well, have relocated here. Belong is a strong word, but are located here now. And how do we reach out to those persons who have been through trauma, who have been through genocide, who have survived these things, whose brains most assuredly now respond in this trauma model that we were talking about earlier? That's their norm now. That's pretty common because as you experience heightened levels of trauma or more intense instances of trauma, the brain starts responding in this manner with the limbic system taking over as it's normal because it needs to remain within a survival context. We need to stay alive so our brain learns how to keep us alive in these contexts. Those are the persons that I work with within our community. People that have incredible knowledge, incredible skills, wonderful cultural backgrounds that can only diversify, make our community more incredible, and add to some of these models of how we engage communities who are less likely to come forward to make themselves known to us. And we talk a little bit about, especially in the field, whenever we're in resource-poor areas, how do we respond to those things? When I was in graduate school, we would do disaster seminars pretty regularly. And one of our seminars folded tech responses into how we respond, which I thought was quite innovative. we were looking at geolocating and data tracking and monitoring through cellular devices. How can we easily go into the field, track where highest needs are? How do we make like scatter plots or any information that we can then break into a narrative that talks about the most pressing needs for a certain group of people? If there's a group of elderly persons who have unique needs, wheelchairs or crutches or certain medications. Women, how do we make sure that populations of women in, let's say, a culture like in a Muslim culture where it's inappropriate for me to maybe go do some of those responses. Where do we find that large group of people, and then how can we best respond? Data tracking, data monitoring has been incredible for that. I know this one sounds a little weird, but also the use of drones or unmanned aircraft within those sectors. We can get supplies places for a fraction of a cost that maybe a helicopter coming in and dumping supplies. A drone can go back and forth and do those things. A drone can also go over and plot disaster regions. Where's the worst flooding? Where has deforestation happened? Where are mudslides going to happen? And plot how we can best get to those areas as well. So, yeah, I just want to throw that little piece into it as well.
What I thought I'd do is actually, I'm curious how many people are in the actual mental health field or would consider themselves a mental health field? Okay. Everybody else, what fields do we have here? Because I want to make this really relevant to your lives. So I'm just curious if technology, I know there's technology, some sort of research?
Research, disaster resilience, climate.
Okay.
Volunteerism in disaster response.
Business consultancy for trauma, for victims, some businesses who experienced the flood, who were impacted by the flood.
We're a rural small community emergency services.
Does anybody have any questions? I have a bunch from the panel, but I think we should start with you guys to see what's going to be relevant.
I mean, Marcus mentioned, if I look at the sort of disaster risk theme of this conference and the climate, the question I would have is, as you're looking at mental health and as you're looking at the fact that we're likely to have much more climate-related disasters, we know they're coming, what would be the critical things that one would do to improve people's resilience, their ability to respond, to open up their brains after it? And are those things in the mental health area, or are they in things like, you mentioned, well, reducing the size, the Katrina type of thing, if that had come ashore? So one of the big debates is, for resilience, is it better to have a lot of small disasters and not have big ones, or is it better to have big ones, which then get people to change? And and one of the key things with resilience is often it is about change, and so it's about people being knocked off their norm and not going back to their pre-existing pattern. So one of my questions overall is, when you look at it from the mental health perspective, what is it that gives people that opportunity to think proactively, to respond that way? And where would your points of entry be on that? Is it through expanded mental health programs per se, or are there synergies with what you've heard in other? So a lot of questions in that question.
Yes.
Not too many answers.
Well, I like you pointing out the fact that the good thing about disasters is it sort of knocks people off their norm, and so there's this, I always think of it as a window of crisis opportunity. This opportunity that crisis presents us to, well, that's all gone, so what do I do now? And I can either go backwards and try to cling to some pieces of what I thought was normal, or with some support usually, I can make some changes that really, people say, oh, well, it was a terrible thing, but our community is better, or my life has changed in a way that I would have never expected, and it's better. So I do think we have that opportunity. And when I talk about resilience, I actually have, I'm pretty simple, you might have guessed from the things I do, I'm pretty simple, so I like to think simply. And I've simplified for myself the idea of resilience having what I call the 3 C's. The communication, connectedness, and control. And I think of those being important in all the fields that have to do with risk reduction and recovery, that whole spectrum of disaster, and in all fields of that. Because I think when we look, I've really seen it in recovery, that people, in order to be and to maintain and even enhance their resilience, they need to be connected. And I think that's one of the things that Matt was talking about, one of us, about being connected in that neighborhood, that community being well networked. I think that's one of the strengths that helps people be resilient. We see that in the research. The isolated people, the lone wolves, they're the ones that can kind of fall off the radar screen and not do so well. People need to be connected to one another. And we can start that before a disaster strikes. I think there are initiatives out doing that, connecting people in their communities. I know it happened after the 4 Mile fire in the mountain communities, trying to connect the communities. So if the next one came, they were better prepared for that. And then the communication. I think communication is key to everything. As a first responder, I certainly know that. And even as a clinician, as a planner, as a trainer, it's key. And that's one of the problems we're having with climate change right now, is the whole communication about it. And not everybody buying into it. So people who aren't necessarily proactive in educating themselves, and then listen to whoever they listen to, may be confused about it, or they simply don't believe it. And then that creates some disconnect in the community. But in a disaster, when it's happening, one of the most effective things is a good public information officer or a good spokesperson who is honest, authentic, as accurate as possible, so people feel some trust and a sense of safety and have information on which they can plan and act. And I think the other thing is control. And I think of control from more of an empowerment position. So that recovering communities, groups in communities planning for things, feel like they have a say in things. That it's not a top-down directive. That doesn't work very well, at least not in our culture. And so finding ways to make sure communication is clear, direct, honest, accurate as possible, which is quickly changing after a disaster. Having ways for people to be able to be involved and be engaged in the planning and in response, and having neighborhoods and communities that are well connected. I think there are ways to address that. And I see it not being a disaster behavioral health role so much as integrating these concepts into all the fields. And maybe, I think one of the things that we're all proposing today is taking disaster behavioral health concepts and the knowledge that we're now integrating into our profession into the other professions. So it's woven in instead of distinctly different.
One of the things I have been thinking about recently is around resilience. It's a piece that's really not talked about a lot. But I'm thinking the one piece is the ability to deal with uncertainty. And I don't think we're very good at that. I think much of what we're seeing today, particularly in this country, is a response of becoming very rigid in our thinking, trying to create environments that don't change because of the level of uncertainty that I think we're really aware of today. I'm not sure how to address that. I think one of the things that maybe, this comes from kind of a mental health perspective, is that people can't change unless they feel safe to make those changes. And I think it's maybe similar with the whole concept of kind of living with uncertainty, is that there has to be a level of safety in order for that to happen. And one of the ways that we create safety, again, is through creating strong, viable communities. You know, I'm not even sure where I heard it. We've kind of talked about it, but one of the big changes that we saw in the 50s and 60s was that we moved from a nation of front porches to a nation of back patios. And I think that loss of community is really the basis of many of the issues that we're seeing, because people just don't feel safe, so they're going to do what they can to create that sense of safety, even if it means creating worlds that are more make-believe than reality.
One thing I was kind of mulling on, but I got to go further last this time, is what we necessarily mean when we talk about a disaster. So for Mother Nature, or the Earth, is a disaster the same thing that it is to us? Or is that just nature running its course? That's pretty commonplace. So at least in mental health, when we're talking about responding to a disaster, we're talking about responding to the persons who are affected. We're talking about a people connection first and foremost. What takes the response to a people connection? That's going to be the grassroots, on the ground, in the trench type of work. So where we need to start with that is, yeah, as we've been talking about, this stuff is tough. It's hard. It takes a bear of a response. Okay, that's what it takes. So are we going to fall into the failings of some of the historical humanitarian aid responses whenever we're talking about this stuff? Throw money at a problem, say we're the experts, the top-down approach. Or are we really looking to make some of these changes that we can now make because something, the status quo, has been shaken up? So what that kind of brings us up to a lot of today's responses, they're very grassroots. I see it as, it's again, a person-centered, community needs-based response. So as much as I admit I'm a bleeding heart, that's one of the reasons why I got into this field. I want to make people feel better, I want to save the world, and I want to do it right now. There's a problem, let's go, I'm ready. Well, that's going to backfire, because my going in guns blazing to a community that's affected, what is that going to do? That's going to be my perspective on changing the community. I'm not the expert of that community. I'm not the expert in the field. I have a background in what I know, and I need to bring that forward. I need to be a person who's willing to take the time to get to know this community, to understand this community, wherever that community is. There has to be trust and buy-in on the community's part to even let me in a room talking about community change or disaster responses. So we have to work, this is a combined and collective approach. We all have to work together. That's where the information technology, the research background really comes in handy. We need to do community needs assessments. We need to do evaluations of the needs on the ground. We need to truly understand what the problems are in this community that's been affected. Because maybe I'm thinking in, take the Haitian earthquake, which I responded to. Whenever I went down, I had a perspective of, okay, well, we'll just make some community mental health centers. We can get people in the door. Let's patch them up with therapy, send them on their way, do some training with peer consultants, people in the community. Well, that's not where the need was. The need was in the tents setting still, the camps of tents that have been there for 4 years. Okay, then let's go there. Let's see what they need. That takes some time. So we're looking at a little bit of time. We're looking at information collection, data monitoring. I don't know how to do that stuff very well. I talk to people. So that's why we need this multi-sectoral approach. We need some buy-in. Also, one of the failings of, I think, the field historically has been that we think that we're going to go in and do this rubber band-aid project. Well, okay, we leave, and then the community says, well, that was a silly thing. What do we do now? And there can be a breakdown in the community. So we need programs to, yes, be resilient, but what does it take to get a program to be resilient? It has to be sustainable. Okay, that's another buzzword. What is sustainable? That means that there's buy-in from the community. There's this entire, full holistic approach to a problem that no, I'm not an expert, but I was trained and I have information. I think that the information and the training and the resources that I have in my back pocket may be of benefit to this community. So we work together to make a sustainable program by using community leaders. We work with peer support persons, people that are interested in kind of getting into this field. A lot of what I do in my training and that I've done abroad is I'll bring in peer support leaders from the community who were at that. So I taught at a Haitian university in psychology and social work. They were interested in going into the community directly, working with people who were still in the camps, setting up community like well-being programs, however that looked like. Was that a soccer youth activity? Okay. Was that going to one of the local official offices and talking about resources that are needed within that tent community? Okay. Those are all the things and anything in between that. But we come together, we share our information, we share our resources, we really join as kind of this global brain of resources. Because yes, I was in rural Haiti responding, but I'm from the United States. We are kind of a global community now, and there are unique challenges that we need to address within that have never before been with us as we respond to these things. So yeah, that's my little 2 cents.
Marcus, did we answer your question?
Didn't have to be an answer when it wasn't that
Or
targeted
answer
question.
a
It was kind of a dialogue starting point.
Yeah, and I want to just piggyback off of what Lynn said about the uncertainty, which is what I spoke to
Right,
last night. I also think it comes from psychology, but the leadership field. Otto Sherman, youth theory, of how to step into the unknown. So it's like let go of everything we know. It's in the background, be in that moment, and let's see what new emerges. I think we could actually learn a lot from some leadership models and some other fields that would trickle in on how to be able to create a meta place of how we enter and answer some of the questions we asked.
And what I heard, just quickly, and then I'll
Yeah.
stop. If I were sitting in a FEMA position or a donor position globally, I heard first, communications, connectedness, control. I get that. I can fund the road, I can fund the Wi-Fi systems, etc. Then I heard the need for processes that actually hit with people. And I go, that's messy. That's time consuming. And this is where, for instance, we lost a big grant around water things in North Africa as an organization, is because we argued for those processes. And yet, the UK government, which was funding it, is looking for quick fixes, and therefore went for a risk assessment program that was much more structural risk, etc. I see this in the 100 Resilient Cities process, where it's connecting directly to, say, CROs like Greg, who's doing a great job, but it's designed to be a second to the mayor and so on. And I think one of the biggest challenges for those who really see this need for the embedded mental response capacity is how do we bridge that disconnect where we see the need, but we've got the answers that's, the funding agencies are going to be running towards Wi-Fi, social, whatever we can do to rebuild the roads, etc. And then that question of getting into the more messy human-centered stuff becomes, that's just an observation behind.
Well, I think what I wanted to follow up on is a perfect little, you helped me with this. Another, I think, failing historically has been transparency in our responses. And we talk a lot about sharing of information for what's needed for the response. Also, we want to be able to hit project outcomes and deliverables with grant responses. So we need to have dialogues about these things. There needs to be transparency in both what is the current situation on the ground, what is the current situation of funding sources, and then we need to be really honest about our responses and then the outcomes of our responses. So our foot in the door, at least with like my background with trying to get in and do some of these, yes, the messier, time-consuming, human fixer-upper type parts of the response often go hand in hand with a response that addresses critical environmental needs for a community. So why can't we tack on a little mental health component to, let's say, a grant that puts in fresh water pumps and filtration systems for a rural area in an African country? We can throw into the grant and try to talk about funders. And this is where I'm kind of a black sheep and on the cutting edge, because I'm trying to use that little buy-in already to then say, well, okay, we could throw some pumps up there, but what's going to happen? Who's going to be getting the water? Is that going to be males from the community? Is that going to be small children? Is that going to be women from the community? Well, what happens if you send out one of the women or the small boys to get this water filtration? What could be some of the long-standing effects? Could those people then be perpetrated on? Because we have a lot of research from historically saying, yes, those people are very much perpetrated on. And then what happens to the community? Well, there's a breakdown in the way the community works, and then the funders can say, oops, what happened to our water filtration program? Why is it not, why is the community not singing our praises again? So I think it's going to take time still as we emerge finding out how some of these addressing the community needs to give very hard line deadlines for projects, and then what the after effect of those projects and our responses are, and trying to tie, again, a more humanistic piece to it. Because I'm one of those weird people that don't see any of these things as separate. I see all of these responses go hand in hand. But I'm weird. But I'm going to keep trying to push that because we're kind of on a front line with some of these responses.
So I think you might be weird, but if you're weird, then we're all weird together. So maybe good company.
Excellent.
How much of that? How much of that is an issue of trust, though? I mean, yeah, it would be great to tack on a line. I can think of 20 things you'd want to tack on a line item to a grant proposal to make the world a better place. Certainly, this being one of them. I think echoing what we heard earlier, it's like if it's do we trust the mental health establishment? Do we even know what they're doing? Like, do we have the vocabulary to understand? Like, I get the sense that the mental health community is still getting its feet under itself, and I mean, having family members and things with mental health issues, I've come to the conclusion that we know basically nothing from the neck up about the human body. I mean, I guess how much of that do you think plays into it, given that it's so fuzzy and squishy, and that the brain is a very complicated place that we admittedly don't understand? You're saying, okay, fund this because it's going to help. How do you know? Well, it might. Is that an issue that you run into?
Yeah, I think one, I want to say that I totally support what Matt's saying, is that if we get the project based on these hard deliverables, and then we insert a piece. And yet, I hear what you're saying too, Aaron, that, well, how do we, if I get this grant, how do I trust you to bring?
Well, and give, I am playing devil's advocate, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, I've drunk the Kool-Aid here. So.
That's right, I know.
Yeah.
And I think, so the change starts coming with us, so that, one, disaster behavioral health people do get their feet under themselves and are able to talk about from the neck up and understand that the neck up, oh my gosh, it's connected with the rest of the body. Isn't that something? that we are an integrated being, and then we start addressing disaster, all of mental health in that way. And particularly with crisis, trauma, and disaster. And then we start educating the people we're working with that that's where we're coming from now. And so they do start trusting, oh, Lisa's not going to go out there and try to shrink anybody's head. She puts on boots and a hard hat and works alongside of everybody and listens so that she's getting an idea of what's going on, gains as much awareness as she can, and is able to talk the language of those people with whom she's working. And so it's not so threatening then to use, I don't know, $10,000, $20,000 of this grant to bring in this piece that can help ensure, or at least hopefully have better chances of success of this project, because all these other psychosocial issues are being addressed right along with the actual project.
I have a lot of information or a lot of personal experience with mental health, with trauma, and because I work with business owners and who have been affected here by the floods, those are the ones that I know the most about. You know, when I see people, I meet with them, and I do see them being really traumatized. And so going back to all of your models of the limbic system taking over, for example, when people here, particularly who live in the mountains, when it rains, they're re-traumatized. So all of their symptoms come to the fore. So my question is, and particularly for you, Lisa, you talked about somatic experiencing, and the main question I have is there a short modality of working with people who have experienced trauma and a disaster, or I mean, trauma can come from lots of different places, or does it have to be a long process? So everything so basically, what are the modalities that are effective and short and who can help people that we're seeing in our communities?
Well, I won't be arrogant enough to say that I can say this is the one method, one model that works best for everybody and in any situation. And although I mentioned somatic experiencing, because that's what I'm trained in, I think there are multiple somatic models that are effective. And I don't think that again, I said, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think I still continue to use all the different skills and techniques that I've learned over my 100-year career. And when I encounter trauma, I bring out this particular tool set to use. I think, yes, there is a short model to be used for stabilization, which is that process of allowing the brain to feel some sense of security and safety. Lynn mentioned safety a lot. I think that's the number one thing. Even when we talk about, making meaning comes after all the brains functioning together. Being able to problem solve is after the limbic system is no longer in control. And there are some ways, and in fact, this is what I've taught in India and Thailand and China and Nepal, is a kind of an abbreviated model for, okay, just some little skills to say for the doctors, when you see somebody sitting there glassy-eyed and they can't respond to your questions, here's some things to do to see if you can't get them here and now, because they're not present. So some skills, and I think, yes, and I've worked with people in one session, and I would say this is the norm. And I don't know that they were healed, but seeing dramatic differences in somebody who was literally, after I worked with her, this is a woman in Thailand, who looked like she was chronically mentally ill and heavily medicated, was able to look around and say, oh, I see my friend. And I said, oh, notice your friend. And she's smiling. She said, oh, I can see again. Everything was dark before. I had no idea that was true. And then she said, and I think I'm ready to go. All of her 4 children were lost in the tsunami. I found the bodies of 2 of my children. I think now I can go look for the other 2. Huge, and with smiling and present. So it's working initially with that holistic model to say, let's see if we can't, even if I give you 5 minutes of feeling safe, your brain can start to stabilize. You guys want to add anything to that?
Yeah. So, first off, I'd like to say, as somebody that works closely with the business community, what a wonderful place for, again, information to be spread, a known community spot that's traversed frequently. We can start responding there within the business owners. We can add, if people are comfortable with it, pamphlets. We can add little flyers on, we're going to have a meeting, a community safe meeting, or just, hey, we experience these types of things in meetings. With Aurora Mental Health, we addressed four demographics. We went from house to house, giving flyers, talking about we're having a person program. We went to schools, we went to faith-based organizations, and we went to businesses. Because the Aurora Theater shooting, it affected people, the people in the movie theater, the workers of the theater. Then the theater, I don't know if you guys are familiar with where it is, it's surrounded by a shopping mall area, and like a suburban outdoor mall area. So we went to those businesses. There were employees that were there. There were employees that heard about it, who had family members, friends, etc. We went and said, hey, I don't know if this would be helpful, but here's some of this information to like the store managers. Could you maybe put this up in the break room if you feel comfortable with it? So we have that. We can, again, engage the community at the community level. Why don't we think about that? So just like, oh yeah, oh that kind of is such a little step, but makes sense. Because people are afraid of mental health. People are afraid of the stigma attached to it. Anxiety is still like a horrifying prospect, or to be affected by one of these things for some reason is a horrible prospect, but it's not. So again, transparency. We're going to blow the doors wide open. I talk to people directly and bluntly in the language of what you can expect. I don't try to re-traumatize people or overburden people with information, but I say, yeah, some people talk about feeling these things after this stuff, and start giving the symptoms that people can make connections to. Because let's say you wake up one day and all of a sudden you wake up out of nowhere and your heart is beating 100 miles an hour and you're sweating profusely. What is wrong with me? What is going on? I don't know. It grows and grows and grows over time. What am I doing? Who am I now? I don't even know myself. Should I talk to people about this? Or am I losing my mind? Who am I now? Okay, well, that's actually just panic symptoms. That's pretty common. I know blah, 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 and all this research, and all these people who have experienced these things too. So again, appropriate information can bring symptom reduction down to just incredible amounts by knowing what's going on, by just having basic information.
We have about 15 minutes.
Okay.
So
Cool.
just actually, do you want to go?
Yeah, I was going to do, and then I have a few, what I like to call quick and dirties. These are small techniques that I do use with clients. These are things that I give to everybody. It's about engaging, and you guys can look these up on your own time since we're a little short on time. But this one's simple. It's called diaphragmatic breathing, or belly breathing. This is not a mental health approach. This is a very old, simple breathing technique that's brought from yoga practices that anybody can teach anybody how to do, or look it up on their own time. But just simple breathing and engaging the body in ways that the diaphragmatic breathing, is belly breathing, actually cuts down the central nervous system's response from the limbic system telling us we're in danger, and helps reorient the body. There's also one, and we'll all do it really, really fast, and I just call it 3 things. So look around the room right now. Tell me 3 things that you guys see that are white. Just either shout them out or say it to yourself.
That are what?
Like white.
White.
Faith.
Cool. Now tell me 3 things that are black.
Chairs.
One. Find 3 different things.
Sweaters.
Most of our clothes.
Cool. Now 3 things that are blue.
Sweater, shirt,
Water bottle.
Cool. So what we did just then, that seemed so unremarkable, but we reoriented the spatial portion of the brain and the nervous system into the here and now present moment. We said we're not back in that traumatizing thing. We're here right now in this community, in this safe space. Because what trauma and crises does, it unsticks us from being present in the here and now. It makes our brain and our body feel like we're literally back experiencing that thing again, that trauma again. So there are some really quick, simple little things like that that we can try and engage people.
thank you.
Yeah, actually, Lynn, I have a question that we haven't addressed yet, and I think from your perspective would be great. How do you look at this from a programmatic and even a public health view? And what does that look like versus kind of the individual stuff that definitely is necessary, but from your point of view, programmatically at the state level?
I think a lot of what we spend our time on programmatically is really the preparation piece. You know, how do we help create resilient communities. And I think there are a number of ways that we're looking at doing that. One is certainly supporting the community mental health centers and developing their response teams, training and support. I work closely with the first responders. We have a first responder resiliency program. You know, for me, it's really how do we promote wellness? It's promotion of the things that we know support individuals. You know, particularly interested in how we work with communities, and particularly, Matt talks about the refugee communities, but the mountain communities, which are very different from the Front Range communities, which are very different than the frontier communities in southeast or southwest Colorado. I hope that.
So this is just terrific. I have a question that sits at maybe a macro level of framing. So I was really compelled last night, Heather, by your Ignite talk, where you juxtaposed, you talk about it in the abstract, trauma and resilience. I thought that was, it just created new ways for me to think about the problem space. I'm also thinking then about a third thing, and I'm not sure what to call it, although maybe it's the politicization of mental health, and maybe I'll even go as far as calling it the aspect of policing during an event, and by which I mean an event I'll restrict it to natural hazards. So something for which the agent, you can't control the agent, right? So there's no idea about what the agent or how to control the agent is. And so one of the things that we hear about in the social science literature on the study of hazards is around the myths of disaster. And they go to specifically the ideas that people can't control or manage themselves. And I know that's not what you're saying, but the idea, there's a very close link, I think, between the idea of trauma and the idea then of people not being able to manage and think for themselves and make good decisions in the moment, even when they're desperate victims of disaster. And that, of course, is all there so that it can set up an infrastructure for policing of natural hazards, right? So I guess the third thing that I wonder is this idea of policing of mental health and how we characterize it during the response, knowing that people will have traumatic experiences possibly afterward. But how do we fit this discussion in of thinking about resilience, understanding that there could and will be trauma that we want to look at personally and collectively, but then how do we manage the ideas of those things during an event and say, in fact, people are quite capable, even though later they might have traumatic experiences. Does that make sense? That's the space that I'm really thinking about and wondering what the experts in the room think about.
Let's start.
Try that one first. One of the things I love is going from, because I am a trained social worker, I think on a macro level, and then going and working at the micro level, and I love integrating those two things. And then trying to get my head around your question, but I think you're right, that supporting the idea of people's capabilities is the important way to approach it. And one, partly through our communications, not communicating, I know you all are suffering and panicking and, horrible things are happening. Well, that helps. It was supporting the positive capabilities. And if we remember that statistically, at the most, about 20% of the people are traumatized. That means 80% of them are doing fine.
Right.
And so 80% of them are going to carry most of that 20%
Right.
as it is. So I think we can, I think my sense is, and even from a public health perspective, we started with changing our languaging to resilience and to wellness, rather than always talking about, well, people, one of the myths that always makes me crazy is, well, people always panic in a disaster.
That's what I'm speaking to. I'm
Yeah,
gonna say it.
I have never
Yeah.
seen panic.
Right.
Now, even as a first responder, I know what my own felt like, but I didn't see it manifested necessarily in anybody else. So that's one of those myths, that people panic. Generally, I don't think they do. And even if they do, many times they're going to respond. That's where the limbic brain is meant to function, to make us get through something in a survival response of fight or flight. And so we use those. We use that reaction, that natural ability of the body to respond through fight or flight. It's freeze, it causes us a little difficulty, but there's some adaptive reasons for that as well. But so you take that out of the 20%, you've got most of them still reacting with fight or flight and not being overwhelmed. And we're really not going to know if they're overwhelmed most of the time until later.
Right.
And so I think, although, yes, I'm a member of Team Rubicon and we're trying to get out there as fast as we can on things, most of the time, other than being an embedded member of the team, we don't need to look at sending a whole huge cadre of disaster behavioral health. We don't need the cavalry out there just yet. Except, I believe, and this is just from my own personal experiences, embedded within the response programs that are going on.
Yeah, disaster behavioral health is not therapy. In fact, a trained therapist, you kind of have to train the therapist now. Disaster behavioral health is really about talking to the individual, finding out what they are, what the needs are, the immediate needs, and helping respond to that. It may be walking with them to a resource or, to the Salvation Army food, whatever it may be. I think Lisa talking about being embedded. We really are part of the overall response team, but we have the advantage of not having a specific kind of responsibility other than helping people help themselves, whatever that may be. And I think recognizing that the majority of people are not going to need mental health services. They need connection to resources. They need to be assured in their own way they are capable.
So do you think the way to translate that up and out, is, because, right, so to those who are framing the discussion around, who aren't in this room, who frame the discussion in ways that we're all battling, right? Is it a way, do we talk about trauma and resilience and we talk about capacity building then as that link between the trauma and resilience, and then the key that opens up so many other opportunities for them thinking about when and how you behave in an emergency response and a mental health point of view, and from institutionally how you respond?
Absolutely, I think so. So one distinction I like to make is that trauma does not equal helplessness, first of all.
Yeah, right.
And the community is always the expert. But what is the community? Who are those persons? How do we identify who community leaders are? How do we identify who looks out for the well-being of the community or the people without voices? Without bulldozing over, without what we believe is a good or a proper response. How do we, again, engage? So what I was trained to do, and I was trained because we realized in these instances of, we'll say like a hazard, a disaster that's a hazard, a lot of times there is not a breakdown in the person, but there's a breakdown in the social systems that help support the person. So we need to look at how do we maintain those systems? How do we maintain channels of information technology, the ability to communicate over multi-sectoral or with whatever agencies, first responders, governmental responders, hospitals in the area, food banks, temporary shelter places. How do we make sure that they remain solid and can reach people that are maybe in a more rural area, or persons who are kind of hidden from the center of where the response is. In disaster response, we often see the airport mile or 2 mile radius. All goods and services in an international posting are sent to that spot, to that airport. So in Haiti, within a 2 mile radius of the Port-au-Prince airport, there was a huge response, and people could come and get goods, water, tent settings, some more clothes, food distribution. What outside of that? It was like a barren no man's land. So we look at, whenever we respond to these things, we are not responding to the immediate disaster solely. We respond to a, in the moment, disaster mental health context. We look at post-disaster. What can we do for the individuals? What can we do for the community systems that are set up? What can we do maybe for even international communication and aid continuation? How do we make sure that post the whatever has happened, we keep those systems in place and solid, accessible to the people, and hopefully, if we did an excellent job, a trusted network that has been made for the community. And then we don't stop there. We go immediately back to a pre-planning phase. We don't say, well, over, done, we did our job, great job, team, go. We expect that, yeah, probably something may happen to this community again in the future. So how do we ensure that these things stay intact in the meantime and don't just kind of peter off as we go? 3 years after a disaster, we hope there's not a breakdown in all of these sustainable programs or these governmental agencies that we put together.
Could I make one quick comment? I just want to kind of piggyback off of what you said, Matt, I think we need more disaster behavioral health minded people in the planning process. So too often we're not involved with the planning because most mental health people don't want to be planners. But that's where it's needed to bring this mindset in.
And I would actually say even like the conversation is, what are we talking about? Because I don't think the answer is there yet of what transcends and includes this trauma and resilience idea.
Right, exactly.
I don't think we actually have the answer, and I think it's going to come from conversation, and I'm not using that as an out, but I don't feel like the next level has quite been there. We kind of know how we're getting there, and there are things to do, but to name it, like to say capacity building is it, I think that's a great option.
Yeah.
But I think we're in that process of what's the next step. So we've got 10 minutes left.
And maybe a response to that at kind of the high level is that, the fact that there is a behavioral health unit as part of the public health response is a significant change. Never has there really been that voice there. And I think behavioral health, as I think this conference demonstrates, is becoming more and more of an issue and recognized as an important piece of the plan and the preparation.
Only because we had a fund down. Preparation happens in the 2 years after disaster.
Yeah, that's post-crisis communication. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So I had a question that's a little bit less related specifically to trauma. So when I think it's been recognized that there's a stigma on mental health, it's hard for people to reach out. Social fabric is really important. That connectivity is really important for resilience. And so I know in Boulder, I think specifically, I live in Boulder, so I can speak to that. There's a big kind of disconnection between people. We aren't as apt to reach out to each other. We're very independent, kind of also very a Western thing that we can kind of take care of ourselves. And then some of the activities that are going on, I wonder how, instead of calling it kind of mental health preparedness, but how could we have activities or engagements with the community that kind of break down those barriers a little bit on the psychological level to open up a pathway for more of that connectivity, to build a stronger social fabric so that when we're going into a disaster, we feel safer, so we're more able to reach out and get that specific need for trauma. So I guess I would like to see ideas or thoughts about ways of including mental health professionals in this process, not specifically under the mental health.
Actually, this would be a great final question. I'm just going to add one thing, Lynn. If you could actually also speak to children while answering this question, that'd be great.
One of my favorite means of addressing mental health, especially in developing context, has been tacking it onto the medical model and looking at things from a medical framework. We have enough information now to really be able to make solid leads to the bio-neurological models of what happens within trauma treatment or disaster recovery, because we know psychologically, physiologically, neurologically that there are significant changes within the body. We've kind of touched on that already. So in populations or in places where I think kind of the mental health, I think we're past bringing it away from being stigmatized or having a negative connotation whenever you put mental health out and tie it to a person directly. I think we need to find other ways of, yeah, like you're saying, different verbiage for it. And the medical verbiage is one of my favorite ways to do it. And that can be folded into kind of a lot of different contexts.
Yeah, I guess what I was asking was really if we were to have like a stakeholder engagement around resilience to build those activities that include the psychological perspective as a part of it, to break down barriers within the community, to allow open pathways to build a social fabric. So I'm not really talking about basically using your knowledge and bringing that into the process to help inform the process to be better and open up those kind of pathways. So.
Yeah, my approach is I pair with, I don't like to reinvent the wheel. I like to pair with responses that are already in place and look at potential improvements to those responses. And I look at it as a holistic approach as well. So I will pair with business-minded persons. I will pair with local hospitals. I can consult with local governments or local nonprofits. They don't even have to be in the social sector. I'll do it with anybody if we can kind of get that doorway open. And one of again, the medical model, we're just talking about what I've seen. And then people really like facts and hard statistics. So I try and have those in my back pocket to be able to really just say, hey, this is what we see. It's very concrete, and then go from there.
I retired from mental health center in Denver, and so kind of came into this position not because I necessarily needed a job, but because I was really given at least freedom to look at doing some things that I've really been interested in. And one of those is looking at how we integrate schools into that community resilience. And for most communities, the schools really represent one of the biggest assets that a community has, not only the facilities, but the people that are in the schools and supporting children and supporting those children's families. So, I'm really interested in thinking about how do we help schools develop those skills, and particularly teachers, to support kids who are going through any kind of crisis, whether it's community-wide or not. And I think we don't necessarily have to identify ourselves as mental health professionals to really get incorporated into and included in those conversations around how do we strengthen communities and how do we strengthen families. Because to me, healthy families can only truly exist in healthy communities. And that's really, for me, the broader conversation. It's not really about necessarily disaster mental health or mental health. It's really about how do we support the health of our communities, which really are and always have been the very basis of mental health.
I think I would combine my response with both of these guys. Again, I think the medical system and the school system are two great entry points for us to be, getting messages out about resilience and and how to stay well and capable and all of that. So I think that's one of the ways we enter, and we do it, by the way, Lynn is talking about, by giving up, and I'm putting the responsibility on us, the mental health providers, giving up the doctor is in status, and just being a member of the team without a clinical identity, to be able to say, let me use my macro and micro knowledge here to see how we can get these messages into the systems that then trickle out and reach throughout the community. So I think, like, if you remember, Matt said from the very beginning that the International Disaster Psychology program at BU is the only master's level program of its kind in the country. So part of the responsibility of getting more disaster trauma framed mental health people into this work is getting people trained and interested in working outside of the comfort of their offices.
That actually concludes our time today, so I'd like to thank the panelists.